Jim was in the middle of recording his final thoughts on a cassette tape in his Paris apartment when he suddenly stopped and said into the microphone, "This is my confession, everything I never told anyone." What happened next left Pamela Courson and two close friends desperately searching for that tape for decades, never finding it. It was June 30th, 1971, 3 days before Morrison's death. The apartment on Rue Beautreillis was suffocatingly hot, the windows open to let in whatever breeze Paris offered that summer. Jim had been drinking wine all afternoon, sitting alone with a small cassette recorder, speaking into it for nearly 2 hours. He'd been in Paris for months, trying to become a poet, trying to escape the doors, trying to figure out who he was beyond the Lizard King persona that had consumed him. But what none of them knew was that Pamela had been listening from the bedroom, pressed against the door, hearing every word of Jim's confession about Miami, about the drugs, about his plans, about his fears. The tape contained 2 hours of Morrison's unfiltered truth. He talked about faking his death, about the darkness that had followed him since childhood, about mistakes he couldn't undo. Pamela later told her friend Diane Gardiner, 23, who was visiting Paris that week and staying in a nearby hotel, that Jim's voice on that tape was different, raw, like he knew he was running out of time. "He confessed everything," Diane whispered years later in an interview. "Pamela played me 30 seconds before she panicked and turned it off. She said Jim would kill her if he knew she'd listened. 3 days later, he was dead in that bathtub, and the tape disappeared forever." Before we continue this story, if you want more untold stories about Jim Morrison and the Doors, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're uncovering the mysteries that changed rock and roll forever. Morrison had been in Paris since March 1971, running from everything Los Angeles represented. The Miami trial had resulted in guilty verdicts in September 1970, and he was facing potential jail time once appeals were exhausted. The Doors had completed L.A. Woman in their final recording sessions together, but Morrison showed up drunk for most of them, clearly done with rock stardom and everything it demanded. He told Ray Manzarek he needed Paris to clear his head, maybe write poetry, maybe never come back to music at all. Ray understood it might be permanent, but hoped the distance would help Jim find clarity. The apartment on Rue Beautreillis became Morrison's sanctuary and prison simultaneously. He'd wake late, usually around noon, spend hours writing in notebooks that filled with increasingly dark poetry, walk through Paris visiting Shakespeare and Company Bookstore and cafes along the Seine, drink wine constantly starting at lunch and continuing through the night, and slowly disappear into a routine that looked peaceful from outside, but felt like dissolution to anyone paying close attention. Pamela joined him in April, bringing her own chaos, her own heroin connections through French dealer Jean de Breteuil, and their relationship oscillated between tender moments of genuine connection and violent arguments fueled by alcohol and drugs. By late June, Morrison's behavior shifted into something deliberately final. He talked about death constantly, not theatrically like his stage performances, but with quiet certainty, as if he'd made decisions he wasn't sharing with anyone. He gave away personal items to friends, books and clothing he said he wouldn't need anymore. He made comments about this being his last summer in Paris, about wanting to leave some kind of record before it was too late. On June 28th, he bought a small portable cassette recorder from an electronics shop near Notre Dame, the kind journalists used for interviews, compact and battery-powered. He told Pamela he wanted to record poetry, maybe create spoken word material, but his intentions were clearly more personal than professional. June 30th, 1971. Morrison woke around noon, drank coffee, and ate little as usual, spent the afternoon reading Rimbaud and making notes in his journal. Around 4 p.m., he told Pamela he needed to be alone for a few hours, asked her to go out, maybe visit friends, or walk through the Marais district. His tone was serious enough that Pamela agreed, but something about Jim's intensity worried her. She left the apartment, walked around the neighborhood for an hour, then came back quietly, letting herself in with her key to hear Morrison's voice coming from the living room, speaking into the cassette recorder in a confessional tone she'd never heard before. Pamela positioned herself in the bedroom doorway, where she could hear clearly, but remain unseen. And for the next 90 minutes, she listened as Jim Morrison confessed everything he'd never said, publicly. The recording started with Morrison explaining this was his testimony, his true account of events the world had misunderstood or never known about. His voice was already slurred from wine, but remained coherent and purposeful. He wanted this recorded, he said, so that someday, after he was gone, people might understand who he actually was versus who they'd created him to be. He talked about his childhood, about Admiral George Morrison and the military discipline that shaped his rebellion, about feeling disconnected from his family from an early age. He talked about the highway incident in New Mexico that he'd claimed shaped his shamanic identity, about watching Native American workers dying on the road when he was 4 years old, then admitted he wasn't entirely sure anymore if that memory was real, or if he'd constructed it later to explain darkness he felt for other reasons he couldn't name. The honesty was brutal and vulnerable, Morrison stripping away the mystique and mythology he'd spent years carefully cultivating. Then he moved to Miami, the March 1st, 1969. Dinner Key Auditorium concert that destroyed the Doors' mainstream career and left Morrison facing criminal charges. On the tape, according to Pamela's later descriptions to friends, Morrison provided a detailed account that differed dramatically from both his public statements and the official court record. He admitted the obscenity wasn't accidental or spontaneous political protest, but deliberate career suicide, a calculated attempt to force an ending because he didn't know how else to escape the trap of fame. He talked about standing on that stage, completely drunk, watching himself perform destruction from some dissociated distance, feeling relief that it was finally over, even as it was happening. The confession contradicted everything Morrison had maintained in court, where he'd pleaded not guilty and revealed a level of intentionality that made the incident more tragic than scandalous. As the recording continued, Morrison's confessions became increasingly personal and damaging. He talked about Pamela, about their toxic relationship, about how they'd been destroying each other slowly over 6 years, how love and addiction and codependency had become impossible to separate. He admitted affairs with other women, admitted moments of deliberate cruelty toward Pamela, admitted using her as both salvation and scapegoat for problems that existed long before they met. Pamela, listening from the doorway with tears running down her face, heard herself described with brutal honesty that hurt precisely because it was true rather than mean. He talked about drugs, admitting his heroin use in Paris was much heavier than anyone knew, that he'd been hiding serious addiction for over a year, that the weight gain and deteriorating appearance weren't just from alcohol, but from opiates, that he and Pamela were using together almost daily through Jean de Breteuil's supply. This admission was significant because Morrison had always maintained publicly that he was primarily a drinker, that hard drugs weren't his preference. But on the tape, he apparently confessed that distinction was false, that he'd been lying to protect his image and avoid harder consequences. But the most disturbing section of the tape involved Morrison talking about his plans to fake his death and disappear completely. He described it not as fantasy or drunken rambling, but as serious consideration, possibly a plan already in motion. He talked about wanting to escape fame entirely, about feeling trapped and suffocated by the Jim Morrison persona, about needing to kill the Lizard King so that James Douglas Morrison could figure out who he was supposed to be without the performance. He mentioned Africa as a destination, mentioned how easy it would be in Paris, where bureaucracy was corruptible, and a body could be buried quickly without autopsy if the right people were paid the right amounts. Whether this was confession of actual planning or just dark wish fulfillment remained ambiguous, but Pamela found it terrifying either way. When Morrison finally stopped recording around 6:30 p.m., Pamela heard him rewind the tape partially, listen to a few sections, then place the cassette recorder back in a drawer and leave the apartment. She waited until his footsteps faded completely down the stairs, then emerged from the bedroom and went directly to the drawer. The cassette recorder was still there, the tape inside, and Pamela couldn't resist the compulsion to hear more. She pressed play and heard Jim's voice, weathered and honest and terrifying in its complete openness. She listened for maybe 30 seconds, heard Jim talking about their relationship with painful accuracy, about how they were poison to each other, and she stopped the tape, overwhelmed by hearing herself described so truthfully. Pamela immediately called her friend, Diane Gardiner, who was in Paris visiting from California and staying at a small hotel in the Latin Quarter. Diane came to the apartment within an hour, and Pamela was still crying, still shaken by what she'd heard. Pamela played Diane a brief segment of the tape, just enough for Diane to understand the gravity of what Morrison had recorded. Diane later recalled in interviews decades after both Morrison and Pamela were dead that Jim's voice on that tape sounded completely different than any interview or performance she'd ever heard. Stripped of all theatrical quality, just raw confession from someone who knew time was running out. Pamela was panicking, saying this was Jim's will, his final testimony, but that it was too honest, too damaging, that if this tape ever became public, it would destroy Morrison's carefully constructed legacy and implicate her in drug use, and possibly even criminal conspiracy if the death-faking plans were taken seriously. The two women debated for hours about what to do. Diane argued the tape should be preserved, that it was historically important, that Morrison clearly wanted his truth documented, or he wouldn't have spent 2 hours recording it. Pamela countered that Jim had made the recording in a moment of drunken honesty he would absolutely regret when sober, that he'd be furious and possibly violent if he discovered she'd listened, that the confessions about heavy drug use and escape plans could lead to investigation or prosecution. Eventually, as night fell over Paris, Pamela made a decision that would haunt researchers for 50 years. She would hide the tape, keep it completely secret from Jim, and only reveal it if and when the time was right. If ever. She took the cassette from the recorder, placed it carefully in a small leather case, and locked it in a different drawer, separate from where Jim had left the recorder, hoping that if he looked for the tape, he'd simply assume he'd misplaced it or forgotten where he put it in his drunken state. The tape would remain hidden, a secret between Pamela and Diane, waiting for some undefined future moment of revelation. July 3rd, 1971. Jim Morrison was found dead in the bathtub of the Rue Beautreillis apartment, under circumstances that remain disputed. In the chaos of dealing with Morrison's sudden death, with French authorities who barely investigated, with the decision to bury him quickly at Père Lachaise Cemetery without autopsy, with notifying the Doors and Morrison's family, Pamela either forgot about the confession tape entirely or made a conscious choice to keep it hidden. She didn't mention it to French police during their minimal questioning. She didn't mention it to Ray Manzarek or the other Doors when they called for information. She didn't mention it to Morrison's parents. The confession tape remained in that locked drawer while Paris, and then the entire world, processed the shocking death of Jim Morrison at age 27. In the weeks following the funeral, as Pamela prepared to return to Los Angeles and close out the Paris apartment, she remembered the tape and faced another decision. She couldn't destroy it, couldn't bring herself to erase Jim's final testimony, but she also couldn't let anyone else hear it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She took the cassette with her back to California, kept it in her possession through 3 years of increasingly heavy drug use and deteriorating mental health, occasionally listened to parts of it when she was drunk or high as a way to feel close to Jim after he was gone. Friends who saw Pamela regularly during those final 3 years reported she would sometimes mention a tape in cryptic terms, would say Jim had left her his confession, would hint that she knew things about his death that nobody else knew, but she never played it for anyone else and never revealed where she kept it. April 25, 1974. Pamela Courson died of a heroin overdose in her Los Angeles apartment at age 27, joining Morrison in the cursed 27 Club. Her death was officially ruled accidental, but friends suspected it might have been intentional, that Pamela had been carrying unbearable guilt about Jim's death and her own role in the drug use that may have killed him. When her apartment was searched by friends and family members in the days following her death, they were looking for personal effects and legal documentation, but they were also looking for something else that Diane Gardiner had told them about, the confession tape. But the tape was completely gone. Her apartment contained hundreds of cassettes, boxes of letters and photographs, several of Jim's notebooks and poetry drafts, but no confession tape. They systematically searched storage units Pamela had rented, searched the homes of friends she might have trusted with something so valuable, questioned everyone who'd been close to her in those final years. Nothing. The tape had either been destroyed by Pamela before her death in a moment of clarity or paranoia, or taken by someone who'd had access to her apartment and recognized its enormous historical and financial value, or hidden so perfectly that it remained undiscovered in some storage space or private collection. The mystery of the missing confession tape immediately became one of the persistent legends surrounding Morrison's death, mentioned in early biographies, investigated by researchers who were trying to piece together the final months in Paris. Ray Manzarek searched for years, followed leads that always went nowhere, interviewed people who claimed to have heard the tape or knew where it was but always turned out to be lying or confused or mistaken. He eventually came to believe that Pamela had deliberately destroyed it in her final months, that she'd decided the tape was too dangerous, that it contained admissions that could hurt living people or expose criminal activity, and she'd either erased or physically destroyed it to protect both Jim's memory and her own legal exposure. Robbie Krieger thought differently. He believed the tape still existed somewhere, that someone had taken it from Pamela's apartment in the chaos after her death, that it was sitting in a private collection somewhere waiting to be discovered or revealed when conditions were right. The financial value alone, he argued, would prevent anyone from destroying it. An authentic 2-hour confession tape from Jim Morrison recorded 3 days before his death would be worth millions to collectors, would be priceless for biographical and historical research. Someone who understood that value wouldn't destroy such an artifact. Whether the confession tape exists somewhere in a private collection or was destroyed decades ago, its legend has become an inseparable part of Morrison's mythology. The idea that Jim recorded his complete unfiltered truth 3 days before dying, that he confessed everything about Miami and drugs and death plans, that this testimony exists somewhere waiting to be found, has captivated Morrison fans and researchers for 50 years. It represents the possibility of finally understanding who Jim Morrison actually was versus who he performed being, of hearing his authentic voice without all the carefully constructed layers of mystique and performance. The search continues even now. Every few years, someone claims to have found the tape, or knows where it is, or has heard bootleg copies circulating in collector networks. Every single claim has turned out to be false, either outright hoax or misidentification of other Morrison recordings. But the search persists because the alternative, accepting that the tape is gone forever or never existed in the first place, means accepting that Morrison's final truth died with him in that Paris bathtub, that we'll never fully understand what happened during those last days, that the deepest mysteries will remain forever mysteries.